Hello and welcome everyone. Today I want to highlight the four most potent ascendancies for minion builds in Path of Exile 2 Early Access or Launch. I'm also going to analyze minion related passives that have been revealed and discuss three potential build archetypes that should serve as a baseline for future minion builds. The Infernalist is a witch ascendancy that focuses on fire damage and starts out in the northern part of the passive tree where most minion nodes are located. The first notable you probably want to take is Loyal Hellhound, which gives you access to the Infernal Hound. It's a permanent minion that doesn't reserve spirit and takes 20% of damage from hits for you. It also ignites nearby enemies, and like other Ascendancy skills, can be empowered by support gems. The number of support sockets scales with player level and reaches their maximum of 5 at around level 80. As long as the Infernal Hound is alive, it greatly increases player survivability and also ignites nearby enemies, which can be used with fire exposure to increase fire damage taken. Pyromantic Pact replaces your mana with Infernal Flame and builds up Infernal Flame equal to the mana cost of the abilities when you use them. Once you reach 100%, you take fire damage equal to your maximum life and energy shield combined, and your Infernal Flame will reset. You also lose 10% of maximum Infernal Flame per second if you haven't built up any in the last 2 seconds. This node itself is about resource management and allows you to use active abilities much more often than you would otherwise be able to. It does require scaling fire resistance early on and a maximum fire resistance later on, as well as a decent amount of recovery to make up for the damage. Bringer of Flames makes all damage from you and your minions contribute to ignite chance and magnitude as long as you're above 30% of maximum Infernal Flame. This means as long as you're above the threshold, damage independent of the type scales the chance to ignite and the damage dealt by said ignite. Since most minion builds will use a mix of different damage types, this will increase damage from ignites overall. You still need to use a setup that works well with ignites. Multiple ignites can be inflicted on enemies, but only the strongest will actually deal damage, meaning you need minions that deal large amounts of damage in a single hit. Seething Body grants you and your minions 20% extra fire damage based off all damage types, but requires you to have high Infernal Flame to be active. We still don't know the exact threshold, which directly determines the impact of the node. If it's active at 51% of max Infernal Flame, it should be pretty useful in general. However, if it requires, let's say, 80% of maximum Infernal Flame, then you have to manage your resource in a precise manner, to the point where minion builds that use a lot of active abilities won't profit much from it. You could alternatively use Altered Flesh, which lets you take 20% of cold and lightning damage as fire damage, as well as 20% of physical damage as chaos damage. This is pretty useful in general as long as you scale fire and chaos resistance, and also helps reducing physical damage, which might be an issue due to the lack of armor nodes in the northern part of the passive tree. It also has potential endgame implications that are not immediately obvious. For starters, Altered Flesh allows you to scale down all elemental damage later on by increasing maximum fire resistance, and also partially negate penetration of elemental resistances and overwhelming of physical damage reduction. We currently don't know how common elemental resistance penetration and overwhelm physical damage reduction in Path of Exile 2 is, but it's definitely an important note to keep in mind. You can also combine this with the Keystone Chaos Inoculation, which would completely negate the physical damage that is taken as chaos damage. Last but not least, there are three notables that allow you to reserve 25% of your life to get a specific amount of spirit, mana, or energy shield based on your maximum life. Depending on the defenses used, the mana or energy shield nodes could be useful to boost your defenses, and the spirit node would enable your build to use more minions or persistent effects, albeit at a hefty cost. Most Infernalist builds will probably use these nodes early on, with Altered Flesh being an option instead of Seething Body, whereas the Reservation nodes should probably only be used with proper endgame builds that have specialized defenses or can afford to reserve life to deal more damage. The Chronomancer is a Sorceress Ascendancy and lacks the minion nodes in the starting area, and also doesn't have any minion specific nodes on the Ascendancy. However, she does have access to a variety of useful utility nodes like Apex of the Moment, which slows nearby enemies by 20%. This should refer to action speed and thus slow attack, cast, and movement speed, which scales minion and player survivability indirectly. Circular Heartbeat lets you recoup 30% of damage as life, which is great for recovering life from hit-based damage. Unlike Path of Exile 1, the base duration of recoup seems to be longer, but I still don't think this makes the Rapid River worth it. Instead, I would take Footprints in the Sand and Ultimate Command to add more defensive utility into the build. Temporal Rift periodically leaves after images, which saves your location, life, energy shield, and mana from that point in time. Using the ability allows you to return to your last after image, which can potentially save your life by dodging abilities you would have otherwise been hit by, or by resetting your life to the previous value. Of course, this can also lead to silly deaths when you accidentally reset your character to a state with low life, or jump back to a location that gets targeted by a powerful ability from a boss. Time Freeze allows you to freeze enemies in time, which seems to cover the entire screen. This gives you time to recover from a powerful hit, allow your permanent minions to resurrect, and in general just get you out of dangerous situations. The downside is that every time you use it against the same enemy, it becomes less effective, which is going to limit the usefulness during long boss encounters. Definitely an interesting ascendancy that's probably best paired with minion builds like Frostmage setups to slow enemies to a crawl. The Bloodmage is another witch ascendancy and starts off with Sanguimancy, which adds a life cost equal to the mana cost to your abilities. In turn, enemies you kill or critically hit spawn life remnants, which recover life and can even overflow it to double its maximum. While clearing areas, the life cost should be more than offset by the remnants you get from enemies, but against bosses this will probably restrict how many active abilities you can use. Grasping Wounds prevents 25% of life loss from hits initially, and that life is then lost over 4 seconds instead. This is literally the main effect of Progenesis from Path of Exile 1, which is a commonly used flask in high-end life builds due to the survivability it provides. It gives you time to recover life via regen, recoup, or simply from life flasks, making you more likely to survive powerful hits. Crimson Power lets you gain energy shield from your body armor as extra maximum life, which makes body armors with lots of energy shield even better at scaling player survivability. The last notable I recommend is open source, which gives your curses infinite duration. Not super useful while clearing areas, but very powerful when fighting bosses since you only ever have to cast your curses once. Compared to other minion builds, which later on want to use a blasphemy setup to automate curses, you can save the spirit that would be reserved by blasphemy, and can also make better use of the weapon swap mechanic. Investing your weapon swap points into curses and setting curses to use that set of weapons allows you to scale your curses without really losing any passive points, which is another advantage open source grants over blasphemy setups. In general, this ascendancy is most suited for players that are looking for a defensive minion build that doesn't use a lot of active abilities. Last but not least, there's the Gemling Legionnaire. He's a bit of a wild card, and just like the Ascendancies before, doesn't provide any bonuses to minions directly. His Ascendancy instead focuses on scaling gems and attributes, which is obviously useful to minion builds. Crystalline Potential increases quality of all skills by 10%, and although we don't know what quality does for minion skills yet, it's safe to say that this will be useful. You can then allocate implanted gems, which increases the level of all skills by 1. This increases accuracy, maximum life, and damage of all minions, while also lowering the spirit that they reserve. After that, you can allocate integrated efficiency for the additional skill slots, which reduces the skill slot pressure in your build. Especially later on, minion builds will run into issues with this due to the number of supporting abilities like buffs, debuffs, and utility minions that you might want to use. The last points could be spent on either Thaumaturgical Infusion to increase maximum resistances, Advanced Thaumaturgy to reduce skill costs, or Gem Studded, which allows you to use 2 copies of support gems in your build. The last option is particularly interesting because it means you can use defensive support gems like Blast Gasp or Meat Shield and powerful offensive support gems more than once. Path of Exile 2 doesn't have a lot of more damage support gems. Allocating Gem Started potentially allows for damage scaling on minions dealing similar types of damage, because now both minions can have the same optimized support gem setup. In terms of Ascendancy notables, the Gemling Legionnaire does look solid, but there are other aspects of build crafting that have to be considered. Which brings me to the next section, the passive tree. This is an interactive version of the passive tree in Path of Exile 2, which is still a work in progress, and the information are not 100% reliable, so take everything that you see with a grain of salt. I mentioned before that the Gemling Legionnaire is a wildcard, and that's because of the starting location of the Mercenary class, which is in the Strength Dexterity area in the south of the passive tree. Analyzing this part of the passive tree reveals one cluster with a minion node and another cluster with the same icons, meaning that this will most likely be a minion cluster as well. In addition to that, there are 3 clusters that buff nearby allies, which should also work with minions. Presence Present grants nearby allies plus 100 to accuracy rating and 35% increased attack damage to you while you have a nearby ally. Mass Hysteria grants you and nearby allies 6% increased attack speed, and Mass Rejuvenation grants you 1% life regen, and nearby allies 2% of your maximum life as life regen. While all of these notables will boost minion power, they pale in comparison to the ones found in the northern part of the passive tree, as you're about to find out. The main form of defense in the southern part is armor and evasion rating, meaning Grim Feast, which is an important source of recovery, also doesn't work with the Gemling Legionnaire. To me, it looks like minions are supposed to occupy more of a support role in the Ascendancy rather than being the primary source of damage, but of course only time will tell. Most of the minion nodes can be found in the northern part of the passive tree, including the starting area at least for the witch. Even if you're playing on the sorceress, you can just path through the right and allocate a bunch of energy shield nodes to boost defenses. I recommend allocating entropy for the increased effect duration, which will be useful in pretty much any minion build. After that, you can either go left or right to access these minion clusters. I would probably go with the right side due to the density of minion nodes, and head left afterwards to get Restless Dead and Crystalline Flesh to improve minion survivability and respawn time. Growing Swarm increases area of effect and can thus be useful for minions that deal damage in an area, as well as increasing the radius of the aura provided by Pain Offering. Afterwards, you probably want to allocate Lord of Horrors so we can use more minions, and Left Hand of Darkness to improve minion survivability further. Right Hand of Darkness doesn't look that great because so far only the sniper seems to deal chaos damage via the command ability, and poison also no longer stacks, making Wither somewhat questionable. Judging by the icons, these clusters also seem to be minion nodes, but haven't been shown directly yet. However, Goblin Inc. showed a number of minion nodes in his Witch Deepdive that he published after the LA event, and most of them look pretty interesting as well. Some of them might actually be small passives, and we don't know where they are located on the passive tree, but they probably account for all the missing nodes. Year of Death grants minions plus 100 flat and 25% increased accuracy rating, which makes this node indispensable since it's one of the few ways of scaling accuracy for minions. Lust for Sacrifice grants 40% increased minion damage while you have at least 2 active offerings, which looks great but seems too conditional to be useful in most situations. Entropic Incarnation grants 30% to chaos resistance and 8% of physical damage as extra chaos damage. This seems to be one of the few sources of chaos damage that minion builds can use generically, so definitely a must-have for minion builds that want to focus on chaos damage. That Can Dance increases evasion rating of minions by 25% and adds your dexterity to minions. The added dexterity grants a small amount of accuracy, so the usefulness of this node mostly depends on how much base evasions your minions have. Silent Guardian improves elemental resistances by 20% and thus scales another important form of minion defenses. Necrotic Touch and Deadly Swarm scale critical hit chance and overall minion damage, which seem to be the only sources of minion crit chance that we've seen so far. The last two nodes are both named Living Death, which is a bit odd. Both are defensive nodes that scale minion resistances and max resistances, or minion life and respawn time, respectively. These nodes alongside Gravedigger look a bit questionable, so I'm not quite sure how reliable this is. Guess we just have to wait until launch to confirm them. In terms of defenses, there's a variety of maximum energy shield nodes that are worth investing. Enhanced Barrier grants 25% increased energy shield and plus 1% to maximum elemental resistances, whereas Eldritch Will grants 3% increased maximum life, mana, and energy shield, as well as 20% of max energy shield as additional stun threshold. I'm not quite sure how important stun threshold scaling will be, but people who've actually played the game mentioned that they had issues with stun locks, so nodes like this should help with that. Other energy shield nodes like Dampening Shield seem pretty decent too, although I would probably not allocate Heavy Buffer due to the reduction of maximum life. Energy Shield recharge works like it does in Path of Exile 1, takes 2 seconds to start recharging, so increasing recharge rate and faster start of recharge seem like worthwhile investments. For that purpose, I would allocate Rapid Recharge and Dependable Ward, which would decrease the starting delay to 1.33 seconds and allow the energy shield to fully recharge in 2 seconds. There is one more defensive node that is worth mentioning, and that's Refocus. It increases recharge rate by another 30% and gives you a 10% chance for energy shield recharge to start whenever you use a skill. I don't think this includes command abilities from skeletal minions, but even without that, this node seems pretty busted, especially minion builds that use a lot of active abilities. In the Strength Intelligence area, there is one minion cluster with defensive nodes that scale max life, resistances, and grant minions life as extra maximum energy shield. Further down the line, you'll find Prism Guard, which scales elemental resistances and maximum elemental resistances, as well as two small nodes with maximum fire resistance, which should be quite useful when playing the Infernalist. In terms of keystones, for now I only recommend Whispers of Doom for the additional curse. Whether Necromantic Talisman will be a worthwhile addition to your build depends on available modifiers on amulets, which we currently know nothing about. Overall, I would say it's pretty obvious that builds have to start out in the north or northwest of the passive tree if they want to access most minion nodes. Starting out in other areas will leave you with little to no minion nodes or cost you a lot of passives in order to reach the relevant parts of the passive tree. Ascendancies and passive points are of course an important part of creating builds, but without an actual skill setup, they mean very little. I've tried my best to come up with viable combinations of skills and support gems, and would like to present 3 minion archetypes and another basic setup for the early campaign. For the start of the campaign, I recommend getting one skeletal arsonist linked to ignition and fire exposure, as well as some skeletal snipers linked to added fire damage and faster attacks. The basic idea is to deploy the gas arrow from the snipers to deal some chaos damage, which can also explode when coming in contact with an ignited enemy. The ignites can come from the sniper, the arsonist, and of course certain bosses can detonate the gas cloud themselves when using detonator abilities. While clearing areas, you can use Contagion linked to Hinder for some extra damage and to slow enemies. Unearth summons bone constructs from corpses, which can spread contagion when raised from affected corpses, which means you won't have to use contagion as often. Since the bone constructs are temporary minions, you can also detonate them with the Arsonist's command ability for some extra fire damage. The fire damage in your build can be boosted with flammability linked to heightened curse, which will be especially useful against bosses. You can use skeletal warriors linked to culling strike to cull rare and unique enemies. This should also work with warriors you get from a scepter. You also want to use Pain Offering to empower your minions, and you should link it to more duration and Last Gasp so it stays active for a longer period of time. I'm not 100% certain Last Gasp works, but since offerings now create minions in the form of a spike, it should in theory keep these spikes alive for another 4 seconds after their life has been depleted. For optimal efficiency, you should target a skeletal warrior with the offering so you don't lose out on too much damage. The last abilities could either be Bone Cage to keep enemies away from you, Zombies to have even more temporary minions while clearing areas, or Bone Storm so you can deal damage to enemies and increase physical damage taken for a couple of attacks. Once you can afford the additional spirit cost, you also might want to use Grim Feast, so nearby enemies and minions drop Grim Remnants on death. These will recover energy shield and can even overflow your energy shield to double its regular maximum, which would greatly help with defenses. You can even link Grim Feast to Vitality to get some life regen. Sadly, this will only affect you and not your minions. You can later transition this to one of the more invested setups, starting with this one that deals mostly fire damage. The basic idea is to use the gas cloud from skeletal snipers to get powerful ignites going. You want to use one or two of them and link the snipers to Ignition, Eternal Flame, Feeding Frenzy, Concentrated Effect, and Minion Mastery. You can also use Flame Wall linked to Fortress support and cast it around your snipers. The projectiles going through the flames will then deal extra fire damage and apply the Flame Wall's secondary burning effects to enemies. The other main damage minions are Skeletal Reavers, which focus more on hit-based damage and should be linked to added fire damage, immolation, close combat, fire penetration, and elemental focus to scale the fire damage as much as possible. You can also enrage them so they gain rage on hit, which increases their damage but also slowly kills them, so we probably want to use a couple of skeletal clerics to offset the damage later on. These clerics don't just heal your other minions, but can also resurrect skeletal minions, which is independent of the permanent minion resurrection timer. It is sensible to link them to Meat Shield, Elemental Army, and Reduced Cooldown to enhance their survivability and the ability to resurrect skeletal minions. While clearing areas, you can use Unearth linked to Spell Echo and Physical Mastery to get bone constructs from corpses. For curses, I recommend Flammability to increase damage and Temporal Chains once you have Whispers of Doom to slow enemies. It might also be sensible to automate this with Blasphemy if you have the spirit to spare. Grim Feast linked to Vitality and potentially Herbalism should help dealing with incoming damage, and Pain Offering linked to more duration and Last Gasp will boost minion damage. The Skeletal Arsonist can inflict fire exposure early on and should later be replaced by the Infernal Hound from the Infernalist Ascendancy in that capacity. Other useful notables from the Ascendancy include Pyromantic Pack for resource management, Seething Body for extra fire damage, and Bring Out Flames for stronger and more consistent ignites. There's another version of this build which is closer to SRS POP from Path of Exile 1. Unlike the previous version, the snipers here are linked to added fire damage, immolation, elemental focus, fast attacks, and minion mastery to scale hit-based damage as much as possible. In terms of numbers, you can add as many as you can while still being able to use the other persistent effects. One of those persistent effects is Raging Spirits, which should be linked with Infernal Legion, Minion Instability, Feeding Frenzy, Fire Penetration, and Fire Mastery. Infernal Legion burns nearby enemies for a percentage of their maximum life, and they also lose 20% of their max life per second. This is useful for Minion Instability, because once they reach low life, they will explode, dealing a percentage of their maximum life as fire damage around them. If the maximum life of the spirits turns out to be too low for Minion Instability to be viable, you can replace fast attacks on the snipers with ranged combat, and replace minion instability and Infernal Legion with faster attacks and close combat. Fire spells that hit enemies with projectiles or have a certain area of effect can summon raging spirits, so you're going to have to use a lot of them to keep up their numbers. I believe AoE based abilities are probably the best all round approach, since most abilities can only hit enemies with one of their projectiles, and scaling AoE scales the number of spirits summoned. The optimal spell is thus most likely either Firestorm or Solar Orb, linked to Area of Effect, Spell Echo, and Unleash. Before that, you'll have to make do with Ember Fusillade. Will probably take a decent amount of damage from casting spells regularly due to Pyromantic Pact, but this should mostly be offset by Grim Feast and the refocus notable from the passive tree that I mentioned earlier. Everything else is pretty similar to the version before, with maybe the exception of Seething Body. I doubt you can consistently stay at high Infernal Flame due to the increased frequency of spellcasts in this version, so Altered Flesh might just be better for this build. Another build I'm interested in is using a Frostmage setup. You would use as many Frost Mages as you can while still being able to support all of the persistent effects and link them to faster casting, cold penetration, minion and cold mastery, as well as critical damage to maximize DPS and minion survivability. They also have a command ability that can call down an icy projectile that explodes on impact that has 100% more chill effect. Frostbomb allows you to reduce enemy life and energy shield regen by 75%, and also inflicts cold exposure, which reduces enemy cold resistance by 15%. For the curses, you can use hypothermia, which should reduce cold resistance, and temporal chains to slow enemies. And just like before, I recommend using a blasphemy setup once you can afford the additional spirit reservation. Freezing Mark increases freeze buildup, and Pain Offering linked to Last Gasp will increase minion damage. You can also use one or two skeletal clerics with the same support links as before to keep your minions topped off and to have another source of resurrection when they die. In order to give your mages another boost in damage, I recommend using Sigil of Power linked to more duration and area of effect. When you stand on the sigil, it gains stages when you spend 50% of your maximum mana, and you as well as allies in the AoE will deal 14% more spell damage per stage up to a maximum of 4 stages. All you have to do is cast the sigil so it covers your minions, move into the AoE, and then start using your other support skills. Since this probably won't deplete your mana quickly enough to get maximum stages within a reasonable amount of time, you're going to have to use another active ability. Eye of Winter inflicts critical weakness, which increases critical hit chance against affected enemies, and should thus be optimal. Before that, you'll have to make do with another cold spell like Frostbolt. It should be linked to Unleash for extra casts, Arcane Search for more cast speed and increased mana regen, as well as Elemental Focus for more damage, and Mana Flare to occasionally consume additional mana. In order to support this, you will have to get some mana regen from the tree, use Clarity support on Grim Feast, and employ your mana flasks more aggressively. This overall makes for very active minion builds, at least if you want to maximize the damage. It could go well with a Chronomancer using the 4 Ascendancy notables I mentioned earlier, and should allow you to safely do high-end content by slowing enemies to a crawl. The last setup is somewhat similar to the first one I showed, in the sense that it also uses Skeletal Reavers and a single Skeletal Sniper to deal damage. The Sniper should be linked to Corrosion, Poison Chance, Deadly Poison, multiple poisons, and added Chaos damage to fully break enemy armor as quickly as possible. The Reavers should be supported by Brutality, Close Combat, melee physical damage, faster attacks, and minion mastery to maximize physical damage. Since this is meant to be played with the Bloodmage, you can use 2 curses without a blasphemy setup and still have perfect curse uptime, at least against bosses. The curses in question should be Enfeeble and Temporal Chains to reduce enemy DPS. Vulnerability isn't really needed since the sniper should be more than capable of fully breaking enemy armor by itself. You can also make use of Bone Storm linked to physical mastery to deal damage and increase physical damage taken, although this would obviously cost you some life due to Sanguimancy. The other abilities are comparable to the first build and thus shouldn't require further explanation. You could of course play this on another Ascendancy too, but I'm not quite sure how well this would hold up against the other builds. Now these setups are far from complete and should thus only serve as a baseline for minion builds. There are lots of unknown factors like base values for the different minions, as well as the impact items and specters will have once they're added to the game. Obviously, there are more potential minion builds utilizing other ascendancies. For example, you could also play the Titan for more armor, max life, and increased small passive effect, and then spec into the southern part of the passive tree, but you're going to face the same issues the Gemling Legionnaire has. One option that would be more interesting is the Stormweaver for enhanced exposure, Energy Shield Recoup for elemental damage, and Arcane Surge, which should go well with the Frostmage build. I personally still prefer the Chronomancer, but I guess it could be an option for some people. I'm still not quite sure what I'm going to play myself, but I'm currently leaning towards the SRS Infernalist and the Frostmage Chronomancer. I've left links to the interactive passive tree, the builds, and PoE2DB in the description of this video. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can leave them in the comments. I try to get them as soon as I can. I'm going to stream the early access launch and in general a lot of Path of Exile 2 in the weeks to come on Twitch. You can find my socials including Twitch, Discord, and Patreon on my channel page on the description of this video. I hope you liked it, and I wish everyone a great launch. Until next time.